Hey guys, today we will be discussing the consequences of the Dred Scott decision, which was the Supreme Court ruling in the case Scott v. Sanford in 1857. This court case was really important during the time. It is one of the direct causes of the Civil War because of the amount of sectionalism that it instigates and fuels. So we'll be looking at the background of the case, the decision of the case, and then how it actually affected America at the time. So let's start off first with the background of the case known as Scott v. Sanford. So Scott refers to Dred Scott. He was an enslaved person who had been taken by one of his masters into a free territory. You can see some of the movement of him and his masters around this time period and around those different areas. But he was taken to a free territory and then taken back into a slave state. And he believed that because he lived as a free person in a free area for a while, that he should not be subjected back into slavery. And so he sued his owner for his freedom. So that's how you get the name Scott v. Sanford, who was the owner. So this case eventually makes its way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court rules several different things. First, number one, the Supreme Court rules that slaves are considered property, which had already been something that most states or slave states had recognized. But now at this point, you have the federal government with the highest court in the land officially saying this and putting this into paper. So now it's been legitimized by the federal government that slaves are not humans, they are actually property. And so at this point, the Supreme Court basically says, listen, Dred Scott shouldn't have even been able to sue because he's not a person, he's not a citizen of the United States, he's property. But the Supreme Court says, while we're here, we're going to make a few other statements about slavery as well. So, number two, the government cannot take property away from its citizens. And so, because of that, if slaves are property, the government technically can't ban slavery. And so it goes further, and the Supreme Court says, all right, so any laws that ban slavery are technically unconstitutional because that's the government taking away private property from the citizens. Thus, slavery can expand anywhere, even into areas that have already declared themselves to be free of slavery. So, as you can imagine, this is going to increase sectionalism drastically. The South is incredibly pleased by this decision because now basically slavery has been given the green light to expand into anywhere into the United States, old areas, new areas. Slavery can basically go anywhere. The North is very frustrated because many of them have been working to maybe abolish slavery everywhere, but at least to stop the expansion of it. But now, basically, the Supreme Court, again, the highest court in the land, has basically said no, slavery can go anywhere. So at this same time that this decision is coming out and the North and the South are reacting to it, we see that there's this election in Illinois over a Senate seat. And I know this is just a small election that's happening, but it catches the eye of the national attention because of who the candidates are. Abraham Lincoln, and Stephen Douglas, they are going to be two candidates that are eventually going to both run for president a few years later. And so you can kind of see some of their ideas and some of their philosophies present in this small scale election in Illinois over the Senate seat. So they're both running to become an Illinois senator, and Lincoln and Douglas agree to have a series of public debates where they will kind of debate out and open their ideas on slavery. So Lincoln's main idea, he's a Republican. The Republican Party at this point is only like 4-ish years old, and he is staunchly anti-slavery expansion. We're going to spend a lot of time later on in the course talking about his personal versus his public or political beliefs on slavery. Personally, he is an abolitionist. He does not believe that slavery is a moral institution. But publicly and politically, he can't really say that slavery should be abolished where it is. especially when the Dred Scott decision has come out and basically says that slavery is okay everywhere. But he can try to argue that slavery should not be expanded at the least. But he gives this really famous speech called the House Divided speech, where basically he says, listen, the US cannot be like a house divided. It will fall in on itself. We have to be either all free or all slave. And these compromises on slavery that we've tried, like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas Nebraska Act, which is technically a compromise as well. He's like, these things are not working and they're driving our country to become so divided that we will have to face a crisis, probably a civil war, to try to figure this stuff out. So we need to decide, are we going to be all free or are we going to be all slave? He then takes this time to basically attack Douglas and he says, listen, Douglas is he has to support the Dred Scott decision, right? I mean, it's what the Supreme Court says. But he's also a Northern Democrat, and he says that popular sovereignty should be used to decide slavery. And you can't really have both of those ideas. You can't support slavery's expansion everywhere, but also say that the people have a right to choose on slavery in their territory. So this is where Douglas responds. Douglas is a Democrat. Remember, he wants popular sovereignty to decide slavery. And basically, what he says is like, listen, in territories that should technically be open to slavery because of the Dred Scott decision, people can ban slavery by making laws that discourage it instead of just banning it outright. So, for example, people living in Nebraska, instead of banning slavery, could just pass laws that tax slaves so high that there's no reason that any slave owner would want to go live in Nebraska because the taxes would be too high. So he's like, how about we just find loopholes instead of actually banning slavery? But a lot of people, supported this idea. He called it the Freeport Doctrine because he announced this idea in Freeport, Illinois, at one of these debates, and it seems to get him enough support to actually win this election. So he becomes the Illinois state senator in 1858. Well, he was already, but he gets reelection. Lincoln, however, is going to use this time that he has lost this election to now actually plan his candidacy for the president position that he will run for in 1860. So yes, Lincoln did lose, but he gains national fame and he gains some time to, start his next campaign for the presidency. All right, the last thing we need to talk about is John Brown. So we talked about John Brown a few objectives ago. Remember, he was in Bleeding, Kansas. He was the orchestrator of the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, where he and his sons attacked a pro-slavery town and killed 5 men in front of their families. Well, he had to escape Kansas for a while, evade arrest, but now he's back on the scene. It's been about, I think the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre was in 1856, so this is 3 years later now. So basically, John Brown has been spending this time planning a massive slave rebellion. And if you want some more background on this, I really suggest that you go watch this video. It's linked in the notes. But basically, his idea is that he and his sons will go capture a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which today is actually in West Virginia, but that's before West Virginia broke away. But they're going to go capture this federal arsenal. They're going to take all of the weapons, and they're going to give these weapons to slaves. And then the slaves will form this huge army that will march throughout the South and basically emancipate slaves and end slavery. So that's what John Brown is kind of thinking in his head is going to happen. So he and his sons, and I think a few other people, they go to the arsenal in Harper's Ferry. They raid it. They are planning to take the guns, but the next thing you know, it's surrounded by troops. And there's a shootout, there's a standoff in which John Brown's sons are actually killed, and John Brown is arrested. And also, no slaves came forward to take any of the weapons that John Brown and his conspirators had tried to capture. Probably for multiple reasons. One is because there's a shootout going on, right? Like the arsenal is surrounded by troops. But another one too is just that it was really risky for them to join a plan like this. It's kind of no wonder that for fear of punishment if this raid didn't go properly, that many slaves didn't come forward. But in the end, John Brown is put on trial and he is convicted of treason and hanged. Initially, John Brown in the North was seen as kind of like this crazy person, but over the course of his trial, where he is actually given the opportunity to speak on his own behalf and kind of explain his reasoning, the North kind of starts to see him as a martyr or a person who sacrifices himself for a cause. Whereas the South sees him as a terrorist. They see him as kind of like their worst nightmare, a person who's trying to instigate this massive slave rebellion in the South. And so John Brown's actions at Harper's Ferry and his subsequent execution increases more sectionalism here, where you have the North versus the South over slavery, and we are just inching closer and closer to a national crisis.